Hello and welcome to Kenduck's Classroom, and where my motto is don't get fooled again on your next history test. So on today's edition of Kenduck's Classroom, what I'd like to do is go over some basic geography terms. So the first term that I want to go over is called the compass rose. What is a compass rose? A compass rose is basically a symbol or a tool that you see on a map or a globe that's used to show direction. And there's four main directions, or there's four what we call the cardinal directions, which are north, south, east, and west. Again, there are four main directions, or what we call the cardinal directions, which are north, south, east, and west. So I'm sure many of you have heard of this before. Maybe you even studied this in another class. Now, if you were to look at a compass rose, there are some other directions that you will see on the compass rose as well. They're known as the intermediate directions. So the intermediate directions are the directions in between the cardinal directions on a compass rose. So for example, an example of an intermediate direction is northeast. So northeast is an example of an intermediate direction. You also have northwest. So this is what's considered northwest. Another example of an intermediate direction. When you're looking at south, you have southeast, and then of course you have southwest. And those are the intermediate directions that you will also see on a compass rose. Now, if you're looking at a map or a globe, you're also going to see something called a key or a legend. Now, what is a key or a legend? A key or a legend is basically an explanation or an identification of certain symbols that you will see on a map. So for example, if you look at a key or a legend on a map, there may be one that shows the different populations of cities. There may be a legend that shows the different temperatures or the different heights and elevation, or for example it could be the type of different weapons that were used in a specific battle if you were looking at a battle map. But essentially what a key or legend is any type of box that you usually see that describes to the person who's looking at the map what exactly they're looking at when you see pictures and symbols on the map. The next term, again real basic, is just simply a globe, which is a model of the Earth. Now I'm going to take a moment and pause, show you an image, and then I'm going to move on to some concepts that are a little bit more challenging. All right, I'm back, and now I'm going to describe a few more geography terms and concepts. Some of them may be a little bit more difficult, but hopefully if you have any questions, you can remember them, and when I see you in class tomorrow, we can discuss these terms. So, the first term that I want to talk about is called a hemisphere. And basically what a hemisphere is half the Earth. And there are four hemispheres. There's a northern hemisphere and a southern hemisphere. And you might have heard of a line of latitude called the equator. The equator is a line that runs east to west that separates the northern hemisphere from the southern hemisphere. Now, of course, besides the northern and the southern hemisphere, there are two other hemispheres. There's the western hemisphere and the eastern hemisphere. And of course, there's a line of longitude that is called the prime meridian, and that's the imaginary line on a map or a globe that separates the eastern hemisphere from the western hemisphere. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to describe lines of latitude and lines of longitude. Now, when you look at a map or you look at a globe, you see these imaginary lines that cross each other. So what are these lines for? These are lines of latitude and lines of longitude, and the purpose of lines of latitude and longitude are to find an exact distance anywhere on planet Earth. So if you look at lines of latitude, these are the lines that run east to west, west to east. The most famous line of latitude, of course, is the equator. And even though the lines of latitude run east to west, what they actually do is they measure distance to the north of the equator and to the south of the equator. And each line is actually given a number. So the equator is actually 0, and distances above to the north and distances below to the south are all measured by different lines of latitude. Also, sometimes lines of latitude are known as parallels. Now, the other lines that you see on a map or a globe that run up and down or north to south are called lines of longitude. Now, even though lines of longitude run up and down or north to south, what they actually do is they measure distances to the east and to the west. And the most famous line of longitude is called the prime meridian. And so the prime meridian runs up and down or north to south, and lines to the east are other meridians. Lines to the west of the prime meridian measure to the west of the prime meridian. So the prime meridian is also known as 0. And by the way, of course, if you didn't catch it already, lines of longitude are often known as meridians. Okay? So here's a little review. You have the prime meridian, and though it runs north to south, what it actually does is it separates the eastern hemisphere from the western hemisphere. Then you've got the most famous line of latitude known as the equator, and although the equator runs east to west, it actually measures distances to the north and to the south. And by the way, of course, the equator separates the northern hemisphere from the southern hemisphere.